Hello, I'm the Shadow Critic, and today I'm talking about the origin of God. Where exactly did God come from? This is a philosophy question that has been asked since the dawn of humanity, and for some reason you've decided to turn to YouTube for the answer to that question. That wasn't very smart of you, but fortunately, by strange and unbelievable events, and due to eldritch forces far beyond humanity's understanding, I happen to have the answer. Now I have to be honest, this discussion is going to take some intellectual power. It's a pretty dense theological and philosophical matter, so we're going to have to use our intellect for it. Now look, I know that our brains are fossilized because we stay up every night watching reruns of Naruto, but still I believe that we do have the intellectual power to handle the in-depth philosophy of this episode. So put down your comic books, turn off Naruto, and get ready to use your intellect. There's a first time for everything, right? Okay, so let's go. So when discussing the subject of God with atheists, one of the best arguments for God is the argument from causality. The argument that everything that begins to exist needs a creator. Since the universe began to exist, that means that everything in the universe had a cause, in a chain of cause and effect. However, this chain of cause and effect cannot go infinitely into the past. It cannot be an infinite regression into the past. That is impossible. The universe and its chain of cause and effect must have had a beginning at some point. There must have been a first cause that caused every other effect. There must have been a start of the chain of cause and effect. There must have been a beginning to the universe. Christians would argue that that first cause was God. So Christians argue that the first cause was God. This is what we say: the first cause that caused all other causes and all other effects, the cause that began the universe, was God. However, this opens us up to a very obvious counter-argument. Atheists reply, well then who created God? Creating a seemingly unsolvable loop. Christians will often reply that no one created God, and God just exists, and then atheists will say we're hypocrites because we say that our own logic doesn't apply to God. Christians will say that God didn't have a beginning, therefore he doesn't need a creator, and atheists will say that we're hypocrites and that we let God be the exception to our logic. But are the atheists right? Do Christians unjustly let God be the exception to their rule? How do we explain God's existence? Well, I will reaffirm that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. But as has already been pointed out, some things do not begin to exist, and therefore they do not need a cause. Obviously, I believe that God is one of these things. The answer to where God came from is nowhere. He's always been. He always has been, he always will be. Therefore, he has no creator. But how can this be possible? Well, all material objects exist in space and time. So any material object, let's say a computer, or a comic book, or a PlayStation 4, it exists in space and time. All material objects exist within space and time. Therefore, they must have a beginning. But certain things, such as metaphysical concepts, do not exist in space and time. Therefore, they do not need a beginning. Allow me to elaborate. Material objects exist in space and time. Therefore, they must have a beginning. But certain conceptual entities do not exist in space and time, and therefore they do not need a beginning. So an example of a concept that exists outside of time and space is the concept of the number 1. Really, you could use any number, but for this particular example, let's go for number 1. The concept of the number 1 exists outside of space and time. Now, when I say the concept of the number 1, I'm not talking about one object. That's not what I'm talking about. So I don't mean like one comic book, or one laptop, or one PlayStation. I mean the actual concept of the number 1 itself. The concept of the number 1 cannot be found in space and time. This is because the concept of the number 1 is a metaphysical concept, and not a physical object that exists in the universe. The concept of the number 1 also has no beginning and no end. Because it doesn't exist in time, the concept of the number 1 has no beginning and no end. So to explain what I mean, answer me this question. When did the concept of the number 1 begin to exist? What date did it begin to exist? Of course, the question is completely unanswerable. It's illogical. It doesn't make sense. The concept of the number 1 never began to exist. It always has existed. For as long as reality has existed, the concept of the number one must exist by nature of what it is. You can't imagine a reality without the concept of the number one. This is because some metaphysical concepts are truly essential, meaning that reality could not exist without them. These concepts are essential to the very nature of reality itself. Some concepts, like the concept of the number one, exist because by their very nature, and by the nature of reality, they must exist. I mean, just try and imagine a universe, try and imagine a reality in which the concept of the number one did not exist. You can't do it. And remember, I'm not talking about a single object, I'm not talking about one object, I'm talking about the concept of the number one. It's impossible to imagine a reality or a universe in which the concept of the number one does not exist. It can't be done, because any reality would have to have the concept of the number one by nature of what reality is, and by nature of what the concept of the number one is. The concept of the number one is an essential element of reality. Because the concept of the number one is an essential element of reality, and because it's a metaphysical conceptual entity that exists outside of time and space, it doesn't need a beginning or an end. If something has no dimensions within time or space, it isn't a physical object, and therefore it doesn't need to obey the rules of time. The concept of the number one is eternal. It has always existed, and it will always exist. That's why you cannot answer my question of when the concept of the number one began to exist. I'll give you another question you'll never be able to answer. When will the concept of the number one stop existing? On what date will the concept of the number one stop existing? You also cannot answer that question, because once again it is a question that makes no sense. The concept of the number one cannot fail to exist. It must exist eternally due to what it is. Now you might say, well, maybe the concept of the number one began to exist when the universe came into creation, and it will stop when the universe goes out of creation. But I disagree. Even if there was no universe, the concept of the number one could still exist. Conceptually speaking, the number one could still be conceived of, and the reality that the number one could exist would still exist, even without a universe. To try and help you imagine what I'm saying, imagine if everyone on the planet died. Imagine if every single person and organism on the planet died. All life on Earth died, and the universe was empty, devoid of all life. Would the concept of the number one still exist? And the answer is, yes it would. Even if there was no life in the universe, the concept of the number one would still exist. Even if there was no universe, the concept of the number one would still exist. A metaphysical conceptual entity like the concept of the number one cannot be destroyed, and it cannot be created. It is eternal. As you may have guessed already, I argue that God is such an entity. He is a metaphysical reality. He's just like the concept of the number one. He exists outside of space and time. Therefore, he doesn't need a beginning, and he doesn't have an end. He is truly eternal. So as for the question of where God came from, the answer is nowhere. He's always existed, and he always will exist. Just like the concept of the number one, he had no beginning and no end. Just as it is impossible and illogical to say that the concept of the number one had a beginning or an end, it is impossible and illogical to say that God had a beginning or an end. This is because God isn't a physical object. He doesn't have dimensions in space and time. You and I are physical objects. We have dimensions in space and time. Everything else in our physical universe is an object that has dimensions in space and time. This means all these things need beginnings and ends. God does not exist in this universe. He does not exist within time. He is above time. He is the creator of time. He is what we call atemporal. Atemporal means that he does not exist in time. He is also aspatial, which means he does not exist in space. Because he doesn't exist in time or space, this means he doesn't need a beginning or an end. So, as for the question of where God came from, the answer is, he's a metaphysical reality that exists beyond time itself. Therefore, he doesn't have a beginning or an end. And I also argue that just like the concept of the number one, he is an essential being that must exist. Now, if you remember, I said that the concept of the number one is an essential metaphysical reality. That means it must exist. You can't have a universe in which the concept of the number one does not exist. You can't have a reality in which the concept of the number one does not exist. It is an essential part of reality. So that's the question of where God came from solved. but I'm going to elaborate on it and explain it in even more detail. So the number one is an essential part of reality. It is a metaphysical concept that must exist due to its own nature and due to the nature of the universe. And as you may have guessed, I believe God is the same. I believe that God is the ultimate atemporal, aspatial first cause. Therefore, I believe reality could not exist without him. So we've seen that concepts such as the number one are metaphysical realities that exist because they must exist, due to the nature of reality. But there are also other concepts, such as the concepts of love, hope, faith, hard work, virtue, and justice. These are all metaphysical concepts, because they do not exist in space and time. They don't have dimensions. They cannot be seen or measured, but any reasonable person knows that they exist and are real, and that they are essential to our lives. So, for instance, you can't go and find me a pound of hard work. That's impossible. You can't find me a litre of virtue. You can't take justice and look at it under a microscope. You can't dissect faith. These things don't exist in our physical reality, but we know they exist. They cannot be perceived by any of our senses or measured in any way, but we know that they exist. Now, there are some atheists who say that they don't actually exist, but that's why I said that any reasonable person would say that they exist. We can't talk sense to those who refuse to see reason. So yes, any rational person would realize that these concepts do exist, even if we cannot see them or measure them. We base our entire lives off these concepts. If someone is unjust to us, we are angry. We feel that our hard work should be rewarded. Faith and hope give us a reason to live. Humans will die to protect those that they love. We know that these metaphysical realities do exist, even if we cannot see or measure them. Like I said, some atheists deny that they exist, but these are very unreasonable and unrational people. And when people are that out of touch with reality, there's really no hope for them. There's nothing you can say to them to bring them back to rationality. Now here's the interesting thing. Just like the concept of the number one, it would be impossible to have a reality without concepts such as love, hope, faith, hard work, virtue, and justice. These metaphysical concepts must exist due to the nature of reality itself. If you don't believe me, just try to imagine a universe or a reality in which concepts such as justice, hard work, faith, and virtue don't exist. Try and imagine a reality in which the concept of justice does not exist. Try and imagine a reality in which the concept of love doesn't exist, or the concept of hope doesn't exist. You can't do it, it's impossible. Now, I'm not talking about individual instances of love, or hope, or faith, or justice. I'm not talking about two people being in love, or someone providing justice, or someone having faith. I'm not talking about those individual instances that happen in space and time. We could imagine a universe devoid of all life in which there has never been an instance of love, or faith, or hope, or justice. But I'm talking about the concept of love, the concept of justice, the concept of faith. Even in a universe devoid of all life, that's always been devoid of all life, these concepts would still exist. So yes, you can imagine a universe in which no one has ever been in love, or a universe in which no one has ever had faith. But even in those universes, the concepts of love and faith still exist. So that's very important. We're not talking about individual instances of love, faith, and justice. We're talking about the concepts of love, faith, and justice. Because the individual instances happen in space and time, but the concepts and metaphysical realities that exist above space and time. So once again, just to make sure that you understand what I'm saying, even if that universe or reality were completely devoid of life, love, faith, hope, and justice must still exist within that universe. Therefore, the concepts of love, hope, faith, and justice are essential elements of reality, and any plausible reality/universe that exists would have to have these concepts as possibilities. Even if those concepts were not found at all within a reality/universe, they must still conceptually exist within said reality/universe. To say otherwise would be logically impossible. Like I said, you cannot imagine a universe in which those concepts just don't exist. But here's the thing. Concepts such as love, mercy, hope, faith, hard work, virtue, goodness, and justice are what God is. Those concepts are the elements of his personality. Those concepts find their utmost origin within God. He is the metaphysical reality they originate from. God is love, faith, mercy, hope, hard work, virtue, goodness, and justice itself. Those metaphysical concepts are the elements of his being. If those metaphysical concepts must exist, then logically he must exist. Because these metaphysical realities exist outside of time and space, and they are the elements that make up God, he exists outside of time and space. The metaphysical realities of faith, hope, love, virtue, hard work, and justice are the elements that make up God. They exist outside of time and space. Therefore, God exists outside of time and space, because all of his components exist outside of time and space. Therefore, the whole being exists outside of time and space. So that's pretty complex to think about. But once again, let me go over it quickly. Any object that began to exist needs a creator. Objects need creators because they exist in time and space. Their dimensions exist in time and space, and anything that exists in time and space needs a creator. It needs a beginning. Metaphysical concepts, such as the number one, do not exist in time and space. You cannot locate the concept of the number one. You can locate one object, but you cannot locate the concept of the number one. This is because the concept of the number one is a metaphysical reality that exists outside of time and space. It has no beginning and it has no end. God is the same. He is a metaphysical reality that exists outside of time and space, with no beginning and no end. Other concepts, such as love, faith, hard work, and justice, also exist outside of time and space. They did not begin to exist, and they will never stop existing. You cannot tell me when the concept of justice began to exist, and you cannot tell me when the concept of justice will stop existing, because it didn't begin to exist, and because it won't stop existing. It is a necessary metaphysical reality. That's why you cannot tell me when it began to exist and when it will stop existing, because it didn't and it won't. It can't. It is a necessary metaphysical reality. So love, faith, mercy, hope, hard work, and justice are examples of metaphysical concepts that have always and will always exist. But those metaphysical concepts are the elements of God's personality. They are the components of God. They make up what God is. He is the concept of love. He is the concept of justice. He is the concept of faith. He is the concept of mercy. He is the concept of kindness. He is the concept of hard work. He is the concept of justice. Because the elements of his being are metaphysical realities that exist outside of time and space without a beginning and without an end, he himself exists outside of time and space without a beginning and without an end. That was pretty complex, but I hope I explained it sufficiently. You might want to re-listen to this one a few times. So there you have it. A random no-name YouTuber has answered the question of where God came from. You probably didn't see that one coming. Okay, well now I've answered the age-old question of where God came from, I guess I'm just going to go and watch some anime or something. Or maybe I'll watch some Scooby-Doo. I don't know. Could be either. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm the Shadow Critic. Oh, by the way, if you don't like the video and subscribe to the channel, me and Sasuke are going to beat your ass.
Follow me! This jutsu. Pretty sad. Time to end this. I'm only going to help this time. Yeah! Let's go, Naruto! Alright, Sasuke!
The victor has been decided.
Well done. Take it from here, will ya?
Round 2. Begin.
Fire style! I won't let you go round 2. Fire style! Fire style! Fire already!
It's about time.
Right here! Take this!
Has been decided. Final round. Begin.
Every genius, no matter how brilliant, dwindles to mediocrity before an Uchiha. Be gone.
The victor has been decided.
You picked the wrong opponent.